New York to Saudi Arabia, which has seen an unprecedented surge in executions this year, with at least 241 people put to death so far in 2025. Among them is Turki al-Jasser, a journalist known for exposing corruption within the royal family. His execution has sparked widespread concern about the use of the death penalty to silence dissent. Joining us now to speak about this is Joey Shea, researcher for Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates at Human Rights Watch. Joey, a very good evening to you, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So if we just look at the figures of 241 for 2025 this year, given the fact that we're halfway down the line, what have the figures been in the past couple of years, even five, for instance?
Yeah, so the numbers that we're seeing this year are truly unprecedented. As you said, 241 individuals have been executed so far in 2025. And actually, we believe that number is now up to at least 242 in even the short period between when we wrote this press release and the time that it came to publication. And looking at these figures, if they continue along the same rate, this year, 2025, will be the largest number of executions in Saudi Arabia's history, unfortunately.
And this spike, what has led to it?
That's a very important question. A few years ago, Mohammed bin Salman had promised publicly to curtail Saudi Arabia's use of the death penalty. And actually, for a few years, we saw somewhat of a decrease in executions. Unfortunately, over the last few years, this number has steadily increased. Last year was a historically high year, and this year, as I explained, is on track to be even higher. From our position as Human Rights Watch, we believe that the impunity that Mohammed bin Salman has enjoyed over the last few years has led to this massive increase in executions, unfortunately.
So, as we mentioned in the introduction, we spoke about Turki al-Jasser, a journalist who was executed for the work that he was doing. Are there many like him in his profession, or is it, across the board, anybody who is seen as dissenting to the authority of the royal family, that this is their fate?
Yeah, so Turki al-Jasser was the first journalist that we have been able to document as being executed or murdered by the Saudi regime since the brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi in 2018. And if you recall, Jamal Khashoggi's murder caused widespread international outrage. And unfortunately, Turki al-Jasser's execution on June 14th of this year, just 2 months ago, didn't elicit such a response. Now, we document many cases of journalists, influencers, civil society members being arrested and detained for peacefully exercising their freedom of expression. However, so far, Turki al-Jasser is an outlying case whereby we see a journalist actually being executed by the state for his Twitter account and for his journalistic work. So this is, unfortunately, perhaps the beginning of an even deeply disturbing trend.
And was this done officially, or was it under other charges that would have been trumped up to justify the eventual outcome?
Yeah, so in the statement that was released by Saudi Arabia's Ministry of Interior on June 14th, so the day that Turki al-Jasser was executed, they said they accused him of a litany of terrorist crimes. Now, in the statement, they offered no evidence to support these claims. And in fact, we have very little details and information on Turki al-Jasser's trial, his period in detention, and in fact, the ultimate decision to hand down the death penalty to him and then execute that penalty. And in fact, his family had visited him very shortly before he was executed, and they had no idea that he had, number one, been sentenced to death, and number two, was up to be executed very shortly thereafter. So his trial, his detention, every part of his case was shrouded in absolute secrecy. And so there's no way that this man received a fair trial nor his full due process rights.
You speak about rights and you also speak about the legal system. I know from the report that you put out that you are working with an organization, also a human rights organization called Reprieve. From what you have been able to gather and what Reprieve, the work that they've done, just in terms of analyzing the criminal justice system and its complicity in these executions, is there any judicial independence at all?
Absolutely not. There is no judicial independence in Saudi Arabia. And in fact, the data that was collected by Reprieve in terms of executions this year, so the 241 individuals, or now 242, we were able to very soundly assert that it's unlikely that any of these individuals received a fair trial before they were executed, given the rampant due process violations and fair trial violations that we have documented over decades in Saudi Arabia. And these include long periods of detention without trial, forced confessions and the use of torture to elicit confessions, any lack of legal assistance and throughout this period. And those are just a few of the rampant due process violations that are intrinsic to Saudi Arabia's criminal justice system.
So al-Jasser was about in his 40s, I understand, and I just want to look at the hundreds of people that have been executed. Do they range in ages, and also what are they accused of doing? And I'm just trying to get a sense of the demographic that has been, executed as a result of this. Were they social activists? Were they members of civil society? Were they politicians? Just to get a sense of how far and wide the dissent is within Saudi Arabia against the regime.
Absolutely, and this is a really important question. So it does seem that Turki al-Jasser was somewhat of an outlier in terms of executions and the death penalty, in that he was a journalist and he was apparently executed for merely his peaceful journalistic work. Reprieve and other organizations have found that the majority of executions that have happened this year have been for nonviolent drug-related offensive. And in fact, a large portion of those individuals are non-Saudis, they're foreigners, they're Egyptian, they're Pakistani, they're from outside of Saudi Arabia. So it's not the case that the state is using the death penalty en masse to silence dissent. But Turki al-Jasser's case is it's cause for concern, and it is sort of a watershed moment that this is the first time that the state has legally executed a journalist. As I said, with Jamal Khashoggi, there was many lies about how he was murdered in the days and hours after his killing came to light, and it only took years of investigative journalistic work for individuals to understand that he was murdered by Saudi agents and likely on the order of Mohammed bin Salman himself. Whereas in the case of Turki al-Jasser, it's right there in the Ministry of Interior's own statement that they executed him and he was a journalist. But yeah, it's not accurate to say that there are many civil society members or many peaceful dissidents who are being executed, but we don't know where this trend may be going.
And that's actually my next question, because I see that a member of the academia, that is Islamic scholar Salman al-Oda, that there's a push apparently by Saudi prosecutors to seek the death penalty there, and that's because of his association, and I don't know whether it's sympathies with statements made by reformist thinker Hassan Faram al-Maliki. So is that also part of what would be described as terrorist acts?
Yeah, so there's a few other cases where individuals have been either, sentenced to death, but the execution has not been carried out, or we've received indication that prosecutors may be seeking the death penalty, and these are the cases that you rightly mentioned here. So Salman al-Auda, Hassan Farhan al-Maliki, they're both. Salman al-Auda is a very prominent Islamic scholar and interpreted to be a dissident, and he's been imprisoned for many years now. now, as has Hassan, Farhan, and Malaki. And again, the death penalty hasn't yet been carried out in these cases, but we do understand that prosecutors are maybe seeking the death penalty in these cases, which is deeply disturbing. And so that's why, we're concerned with the case of Turki al-Jasser, because so far, the death penalty has sort of been hanging over these cases, but not yet actually executed. And we're concerned that Turki al-Jasser's case may be a sort of turning point in the road, and Saudi authorities may actually increasingly carry out the executions themselves. We also documented a case a few years ago of a retired teacher, a man named Mohammed al-Ghamdi, who was originally sentenced to death based purely on his peaceful social media activity. His death sentence was later reduced, we think, due to public pressure. But again, there's a few of these cases that are hanging around that we're fearful may end up in the same case, in the same way as Turki al-Jasser, unfortunately.
And I'm curious about that. The public pressure brought to bear. What was it that dissuaded the regime from pursuing that action that they already were on? Because I'm thinking in terms of the Arab Charter on Human Rights, of which Saudi Arabia is a signatory, would a statute like that enforce greater pressure against weaponizing the death penalty for repression, or was there something else that swayed them in this case?
I would hope that it was the Arab Charter on Human Rights, but unfortunately, I think Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman really does not care for any of these international treaties, even the ones to which Saudi Arabia is signed. In the case of Mohammed al-Ghamdi, the retired teacher, I believe that his death sentence was commuted because, this was a story that went viral, a teacher sentenced to death for tweets. And Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was actually asked about this case himself specifically in an interview with Fox News, where he said, there are many laws in this country that are old laws that we're working to change. This was, of course, a lie because the law under which Mohammed al-Ghamdi was sentenced to death was a new law passed in 2017 during the period in which Mohammed bin Salman has come to power. But I think the fact that this Fox interviewer asked him specifically about this case gave Mohammed al-Ghamdi a degree of protection, because ultimately Mohammed bin Salman really cares about Saudi Arabia's international reputation. He wants to attract foreign investment, he wants to attract tourism, and it's ultimately bad for business if the country is having headlines because they're executing teachers for tweeting.
And given that, just as a final question, then visits like that from President Donald Trump to Saudi Arabia, would that be impetus enough that should there be a wider and louder outcry, that he and his regime would be dissuaded from further actions such as these?
Yeah, I would hope that, visits by Western leaders from countries who at least profess to care about human rights would make a difference. I mean, I do think that over the past many years, we've seen these relationships for what they are, which is largely transactional. And, we just have to look at all of the, abuses that are happening right now in the United States to see through this sort of hollow veneer of, these countries and what they profess to believe in their human rights records. As I said, it would be our hope for these different visits to give a degree of protection and to help, encourage human rights. But ultimately, I think for the U.S. and for Saudi Arabia, the economic relations and trade relations trump, for lack of a better word, everything else.
Well, Joey, thank you so much for speaking to us, and we will obviously keep tabs on this and speak to you about any further such incidents and if there's been a change in trend. Joey Shea is researcher for Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates at Human Rights Watch, speaking to us about what they've noticed as a surge in executions in Saudi Arabia in 2025, speaking specifically about, in this case, a case of journalist Turki al-Jasser. Brings the time to 28 minutes past 9. You are listening to Africa World Hour here on Channel Africa, the African Perspective.